persuasive rhetoric, specifically the rhetoric that's used by one church to secure some surprising accommodations in statutes governing murder, manslaughter, criminally negligent homicide, and a variety of other offenses. And when we talk about blurring the line today, this is one very important area in which the line gets blurred between church and state, because these areas, these religious exemptions to these laws, result in the deaths of children. And I became interested in this subject because of stories like that of Amy Hermanson. Amy Hermanson was a 7-year-old. She died in 1986 in Sarasota. A talented little girl, she took piano, violin, harp, and art lessons, and she excelled in academic subjects also. Many teachers and employers at her mother's business observed her weight loss and lethargy over a 4-week period, but they didn't report to Child Protection Services. They didn't know that she had diabetes. Some assumed that the parents were providing medical treatment. One employee said that she didn't report to Child Protective Services because she knew that the Hermansons were Christian Scientists and they were signing her paycheck. A neighbor urged Amy's mother to take her to a doctor, but the mother refused. A few minutes later, Amy crawled in from another room on her hands and knees and begged her mother to take her home. Her aunt said that she was incoherent and unable to focus her eyes the day before she died. The medical examiner concluded that medical treatment up to just hours before her death could probably have saved her. Her parents acknowledged that they never sought that kind of treatment. The Hermansons were convicted of felony child abuse and third-degree murder, but in 1992, the Florida Supreme Court overturned their conviction on fair notice grounds. Florida has a religious exemption in the Civil Code, but the court held that that exemption caused confusion about criminal liability, stating, "The statutes have created a trap that the legislature should address." Nearly 20 years later, the Florida legislature still has not done so. In many other cases, authorities have not even sought convictions because of statutory exemptions for even the most serious of crimes against children. And I'll give you some examples. Iowa and Ohio have religious defenses to manslaughter. Delaware and West Virginia have religious defenses to the murder of a child. Arkansas has a religious defense to capital murder. Oregon has a religious defense to homicide by abuse. And for example, in Oregon, despite repeated child deaths, including that of a 4-year-old who died in 1989 after suffering for 47 days from a treatable respiratory infection, and 10 years later, a 14-year-old who died after 2 to 4 weeks of suffering from untreated diabetes, authorities refused to prosecute because of exemptions like the one they had in their law. This one here, which says that religious beliefs can be an affirmative defense to murder. These religious clauses are interesting for several reasons. The first one is the obvious drama of stories like these. Another reason is that religious motivation isn't a defense for everything. For example, if I have religious beliefs that preclude me from paying income tax, too bad, I still have to pay my income tax. These beliefs these exemptions are not constitutionally mandated. In fact, some think that because of the Prince opinion, they aren't even constitutional. And I saw that that wasn't in the booklet, so just to show you some of the text. Basically, the Supreme Court decided in 1944 that parents are free to become martyrs for their religion, but they aren't free to make their children martyrs. And these religious exemptions aren't even time-honored. Most of them were enacted in the mid-'70s as the result of a federal funding bill during the Nixon administration, and Nixon had Christian Scientists among his chief advisors. That requirement was repealed in 1983, but by that time it had gotten into the laws of most U.S. states. Another surprising thing about these laws is that they're so recent. Our society is increasingly protective of children. We have things like seatbelt laws, peanut-free zones in schools, mandated family viewing hours on television, but all of these things are seen as legitimate expressions of society's interest in protecting children, but we still have exemptions to these laws. As I said before, my field isn't law but rhetoric, and I figured it must take some pretty persuasive rhetoric to convince legislators that these religion clauses are a good idea. I set out to discover what arguments are so convincing that parents like Amy's would not be required to take their child to a doctor during a 4-week illness, but would be required to put her in a child safety seat. Now, at least in the absence of large campaign contributions, it can be difficult to tell why legislators do what they do. But it is possible to study the arguments that have repeatedly been made in support of these accommodations, and that's what I set out to do. So I decided to analyze persuasive texts written by spokespeople for the Christian Science Church. First question, why Christian Scientists? Well, the Christian Science Church is arguably the most influential faith-healing sect in the U.S., and in fact, in several states, the statutes that have these exemptions specifically mention Christian Science, or they use language that's peculiar to Christian Science, talking about, for example, practitioners. Here are the texts that I looked at. Most of these were letters to the press. These were published first in secular periodicals, sometimes on radio shows and other places. Then they were reprinted in the religious magazine, the Christian Science Sentinel. I also looked at other related texts. I looked at some of the legislative discussion surrounding Oregon House Bills 2494 and 2596, which dealt with this issue. Mostly when I looked at these, I was looking for consistent rhetorical strategies. I figured if these strategies are consistent, the church must think that they're effective, or they wouldn't keep using them. Now, who wrote these texts? Most of these texts were written by what are called committees on publication. They're official Christian Science spokespeople, and the word committee just refers to one person. This is an archaic grammatical usage. It means committed to, kind of like employee means employed by. So they're called COPs, or committees on publication, and they have two jobs. The first job is to police the media, and this quote you see talks about all of the many things that COPs have policed in the course of their history since 1899, when the positions were established. And you can see it covers radio and television talk shows, sermons, novels, plays, textbooks, sex magazines, etc., etc., etc. About the only things not covered here are cereal boxes and fortune cookies. The other job of the COPs is to lobby legislators and administrators for policies favorable to the Christian Science Church. And these positions are full-time paid positions. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over all the theoretical, rhetorical stuff and just go straight to my findings. These are some of the things that the COPs do to make their rhetoric persuasive. First, they identify themselves with two very powerful ideas. One is religion, one is science. And you can see that in the name of the religion, Christian Science. Usually, we consider religion and science to be opposites. In fact, C.P. Snow wrote a famous book about that. By identifying itself with science, Christian Science protects itself against religious challenges. By identifying itself with religion, Christian Science protects itself against science challenges. And I'm going to show you some examples of how this works. One thing that the Christian Science spokespeople do is they imitate medical language. This comes from a statement that the CDC asked them to write after an outbreak of measles among Christian Scientists who are usually exempt from being vaccinated. For over 100 years, accounts of healing have been published in church periodicals, and then it goes on to use a lot of medical-sounding language. A substantial amount involved medically diagnosed diseases, in many cases determined to be congenital, incurable, or terminal. Over 40% concerning a specific physical disorder. They talk about conditions that were medically diagnosed. All of this language sounds very scientific. They also talk about how these testimonies are considered to be verified. But for a Christian Scientist, verification basically means, I trust this guy. Here's the statement of what it means for a testimony to be verified. Basically, 3 members of the church vouch for the integrity of the testifier. And they get the names and addresses. Now, if you aren't convinced by, well, let me back up. I'm not showing this just to say whether or not the testimonies are true. It's entirely possible that all of these testimonies are true. I didn't set out to examine that. It's quite possible that if you used conventional scientific method to examine these testimonies, you'd get to the same conclusion that the Christian Scientists got to. But my point here is that they're not providing that evidence. If they're not providing that evidence, that suggests that they think the medical style vocabulary is going to be persuasive by itself. Another thing that they do is basically say, hey, if we wouldn't have laws about it if it didn't work. So here are a couple quotes saying, it's the long-term effectiveness of Christian Science healing that explains why these laws have been enacted. In other words, legislators wouldn't dream of passing any laws that weren't supported by rigorous scientific investigation. Would that that were true. Another strategy, they try to turn the tables. They assume that Christian Science works, and then they try to question medical science. So they say, a few parents who have lost children under medical care question the legitimacy of medicine. So why is it fair to say if you lose your child under religious care that you question the validity of the religious care? And if you're not convinced by these kinds of arguments, they say that you're just basically blinded by faith. And they make this equation a lot. And they talk about how some of our society just can't stand to have our secular assumptions questioned by this religion. And that they're not asking for anything other than the ability to just say, we're going to give our children what works. And the effect of all of this is to shift the burden of proof from them to show that Christian Science healthcare works to the people who would say it doesn't work. They talk about how if our system of care generally fails, well, then we can legislate against it. But we shouldn't legislate against it unless it fails. Now imagine if this were a new drug. The argument would be, let's let everybody take this drug, and if a lot of people die, then we can control it. It's backward. These arguments sound great, but they probably wouldn't be convincing on their own. There are also a lot of religious claims. Here are a number of statements where the church is emphasizing common religious values, talking about how religious freedoms are very dear to us all. Lots of churches include healing in their services. We all believe in the freedom to worship and practice our religion. All of that's very true. And they also equate legislating against spiritual health care with being un-American. So you're un-American if you would restrict the practice of Christian Science or other faith-healing religions, because an American value is to allow freedom. These religious claims help insulate Christian Science from criticism. Criticism is okay for science. The scientific method is based on skepticism. But criticism is not okay for religion. If you say that a religion is wrong, you're a bigot. So here's another quote. And again, all of these quotes are written by official Christian Science spokespeople for various publications. This one says, it's always possible for a determined detractor to sketch a dark picture with a few well-chosen and carefully rearranged facts about cases where children have died. And then it goes on to say, basically, if you do this, you're just like the people that were doubtful about Jesus' miracles. So when you add these religious appeals to the scientific appeals, the effect is to basically block out any kind of criticism. You can't verify things scientifically, because in order to do that, you would have to be skeptical. Also, in order to do that, you would have to put the burden of proof on the people that were proposing this, and the church is shifting the burden of proof onto outsiders. When you adopt your attitude of skepticism to go along with the scientific method, then the church implies that you're a bigot. So basically, you can't win. It would be naive to say that this rhetoric alone is responsible for all of the religion clauses. The church's ability to finance and organize letter-writing campaigns, campaign contributions, and so forth undoubtedly has much to do with its success. But the lobbying would undoubtedly not succeed if the rhetoric were less persuasive. And again, Oregon is worth looking at here. After widespread public outcry over numbers of childhood deaths, the State House in Oregon drafted legislation in 1999 that would remove all 9 of their religious clauses. The Oregonian described the debates as thorny and deeply complicated, in part because of lobbying by the Christian Science Church, lobbying that one legal advisor called a grassroots lobbying effort that matched, if not exceeded, the drive that the National Rifle Association had on the gun issue. Ultimately, one of the sponsors of that bill, Oregon Representative Bill Witt, refused to vote for his own bill, and this was why. He said, "I'm concerned that this bill in some way denigrates spiritual healing, and I would suggest that if we were looking at a few cases where medical means were used to bring about a cure and those means failed, and we looked at that just in perspective, just looking at the failures of medicine, we might have a bill here today which would criminalize someone who is only using medical means of healing." In reality, we're looking at one side of the coin. We're looking at where folks have tried to use spiritual healing and it has not worked as their only remedy. But we're ignoring the cases where spiritual healing has been used successfully. And I don't believe that medical means are the only means or a superior means of healing someone who is sick. And here you can see he's basically adopting the same arguments that the Christian Science lobbyists say, which is that religion is just another kind of health care, and we should be treating them exactly the same. And just seconds before, literally seconds before I left my office to come here, I got a letter from someone in Iowa, a child advocate in Iowa, where they're also considering laws that would overturn their religious exemptions. And the Christian Science spokesperson used very similar arguments there also. So if this rhetorical analysis is correct, it can help explain how church lobbyists succeed and also why it's so difficult for opponents to persuade legislators to repeal these exemptions. For example, the American Association of Pediatrics and the American Medical Association both have taken public stands against these exemption clauses, but they both sound anti-religion or maybe too attached to their belief in medicine to be objective. And another opponent is Children's Healthcare as a Legal Duty, or CHILD, which is an organization founded specifically to oppose these exemptions. But the founder of that is a former Christian Zionist, so frequently she's described as a dissident former church member, and then people think she's not objective and they don't listen to her. Also, this analysis may help explain why public outcry over these deaths, which is widespread, hasn't actually translated to public policy. Because the Christian Science Church asserts a significant healing record and implies that skepticism about its record can only be a result of prejudice, Americans may be reluctant to investigate further. Until we find a way to counter or expose the fallacies behind these arguments, it's likely that religious exemptions will remain on the books. And the next child who dies, like Amy Hermanson, will have succumbed not just to a disease, but to an argument.
I come as a representative of a history department, and so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is in a very different line from what you've heard so far today. I've entitled my paper A Very Long View from the Academy, Blurring the Line Between Church and State in Nicaea and in the Da Vinci Code. Everything has to have a Da Vinci Code connection, so I have a little bit of that today. In this, again, it's a departure. My own expertise is as an ancient historian, specifically a historian of the Roman Empire and its adoption of Christianity in this particular moment. I also speak as a former Southern Baptist who was actively involved in the denomination as it was being transformed into a potent political force in the 1980s and 1990s. I wish to offer a historical scenario, one that is drawn from one of the first and most significant blurrings of church and state, such as they were in the period. I'm going to be talking about the Council at Nicaea, which was held under the authority of the Emperor Constantine in the summer of AD 325. I want to look at the effect of that council within a religious tradition. Instead of looking at the effect of public policy, the interaction between church and state, the approach I want to take is how does imperial or governmental involvement in a religion affect the religion internally? What kinds of things can we expect to see? And then I'll ask some general questions about modern parallels that we might see from something that does seem remote over 1,500 years ago. And where better to begin than from the lauded tome by Dan Brown, the famous and scintillating Da Vinci Code. Assuming you've heard some of it, you expect the film to come out, you may know something about the Da Vinci Code. In his rather turgid exposition of the facts about Jesus' identity to Sophie Neveu and Robert Langdon, Lee Tibbing comments on the council at Nicaea in these terms. At this gathering, Tibbing said, many aspects of Christianity were debated and voted upon. The date of Easter, the role of the bishops, the administration of sacraments, and, of course, the divinity of Jesus. And then there's a murmur of disagreement. Right, Teebing said, Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicaea. Hold on, you're saying Jesus' divinity was the result of a vote? A relatively close vote at that, Teebing added. Now, that's not only bad prose, it's obviously wrong from a historical viewpoint on many points. The debate at Nicaea was an important one, but there was no question among the 200 to 300 bishops assembled that Christ was divine. The difficulty was with the degree of divinity and how to understand that divinity in a larger theological context. The debate came down to two words, homoousios and homoiousios, one iota of difference between them, which gives rise to our expression. The homoousios is the concept that Jesus and God are one being, one unity. Homoi adds the idea that they're similar in substance, in unity. Same and similar. The same words in English had the same problems in Greek. And much of the debate at Nicaea was concerned about the proper interpretation of that word. It was debated by theologians in the entire early history of Christianity. In the early 3 centuries, Christianity was maturing, it was spreading. However, the vast majority of those assembled at Nicaea already sided with Athanasius, the exponent of the homoousios position, and against Arius, that God was the same substance as Jesus, and the resulting Nicene Creed codified this position. It drove the Arians, the follower of the Bishop Arius, into exile, as we will explore in a moment. Moreover, there was not really a vote at Nicaea, contrary to Dan Brown. What Brown misses here, in many ways, is the chance to comment on the stagecraft of the event at Nicaea. In many ways, the unspoken body language, the rhetoric, if you will, to go along with our previous paper, of the emperor's movements and behavior at this crucial moment in the history of Christianity. The majority of our information about Nicaea comes from one document, the Life of Constantine, written by the Bishop Eusebius, who was a friend of Constantine, a close personal associate, and probably at the council itself. So he was giving an eyewitness account with the nuances that would inevitably creep in anytime anybody would talk about Constantine. And whatever the facts of his famous conversion in 312 CE, most scholars today would concede that there seems to have been some transformation in Constantine's life. The fact of his late baptism does not mean, Pace Dan Brown, that he was not really a Christian before he reached his deathbed. It was clear from the beginning of his sole reign that he favored the Christians and that the smart up-and-coming politicians of the regime labored to jump onto the bandwagon that the Christians represented. The problem was that despite periodic persecution and extremely small numbers, until around 300, the Christians were subject to vociferous and bitter conflicts among themselves about complex theological issues for his own reasons, perhaps a combination of his sincere interest in Christian doctrine, but also in the attempt to unify his empire under one Christian commitment. Constantine convened an assembly of bishops to be held at Nicaea in May of 325. Now, how he did it is a remarkable point in trying to understand what happened. And here his own words that we have from one crucial document illustrate what may have been his motives. This is the Constantine's summons to the bishops of the Roman Empire. That there is nothing more honorable in my sight than the fear of God is, I believe, obvious to everyone. Now, because it was agreed formally that the Synod of Bishops should meet in Ancyra of Galatia, it has seemed to us on many accounts that it would be well for a synod to assemble at Nicaea, a city in Bithynia, both because the bishops from Italy and the rest of the countries of Europe are coming, and because of the excellent temperature of the air. Another incident is it's only a few miles from where the emperor was housed in his palace, but that's not what he says here. And in order that I may be present as a spectator and participator in those things which will be done. In other words, I will be a participator and spectator. So I ask you speedily to come, that each bishop may be in his own person present as a spectator of those things which will be done by the same. He allowed the bishops coming to Nicaea to use the public highways at public expense. He paid all of their living expenses while they were at the council, and he wished them to assemble at one place in a remarkably short period of time. In the moment in which the council began, and I want you to kind of envision it because the stagecraft really is quite astonishing. The bishops took their place on benches arranged in rows along the length of the hall. Picture this room transformed into a long line of benches. And all of the bishops were assembled in solid lines. The emperor was not in the room at the moment. Then, in silence, Constantine's attendants entered. Not the usual bodyguard, but friends of the emperor who were also Christians. They all came pointedly without weapons, even though the emperor had quite a few bodyguards stationed just outside the door in which the council was assembled. At a sign, all of the bishops in the room stood at attention, rather like we did for the invocation that Representative Frey offered. Constantine entered, wearing the imperial purple with a diadem and insignia of gold and diamonds. One observer at the site said that he dazzled in the light that was filtering through the room because of so much gold and diamonds on his person. A small stool of wood encrusted with gold was produced and put right in the middle of the room for the emperor to sit upon. Eusebius says that he entered the room with downcast eyes, modest hesitancy, blushing humility. He says, for example, the emperor was determined to make everyone feel better. He, with shining eyes, looked kindly on them all, and then, collecting his thoughts in a soft and gentle voice, gave a speech. The story goes that when Constantine entered the room, he asked the bishop's permission. May I sit among you and listen to what you're talking about? It was granted. He sat down, and then the others sat. The bishop on his left rose and delivered a celebratory speech in his honor. Constantine replied briefly and formally in Latin, and then his speech was translated into Greek for those who did not know Latin. Once the debate began, Constantine sat apart from the bishops, but we know from many documents that he was close enough to participate in them. Eusebius said he spoke in Greek, settling the bishops' differences, urging concord of opinion in a very specific manner. The emperor listened to all without resentment and received the proposals with patient flexibility. He took up what was said by each in turn and gently brought together those whose attitudes conflicted. He addressed each person gently. And by speaking Greek, for he was not ignorant of that language either, he made himself pleasant and agreeable, persuading some and shaming others with his words, praising those who were speaking well, urging all towards agreement until he had brought them to one mind. This is, again, a biased witness, but that's the perspective. In another relatively positive assessment of Constantine, one modern scholar has said, Constantine intervened with the voice of reason to advise moderation. The creed that resulted is one that's familiar to any Christian who's spoken it at one point in his or her life. It included, however, an exegesis, a specific theological argument written by Constantine himself to go along with the creed, in which he clearly expected all of the assembled bishops to take on what he had said without any question. And he fully expected them all to agree. It was presented after a few weeks in conference on the 19th of June. Only 2 bishops in all of this several hundred refused to sign the document. And they departed post-haste into immediate exile, together with Arius and some of the priests who sided with him. This isn't the end of the story, by the way, because when Constantine died in 337, his son Constantius supported the Arian position and welcomed the Orthodox bishops back, or invited them kindly to go into exile themselves, and the Arian bishops were welcomed back to the empire. In 361, another astonishing turn of events. The next emperor, Julian, rose to the imperial purple, a relative of Constantine, who announced soon after his accession that he wasn't a Christian at all, Arian or Orthodox. In fact, he was a pagan and would now start persecuting Christians. Before he did that, he made a swift move, which was to recall all of the exiled bishops back to the Roman Empire. According to his admirer, Ammianus Marcellinus, he did it for a particular reason. His motive in insisting on this was that he knew that toleration would intensify their divisions, and that henceforth he would no longer have to fear a unanimous public opinion. Experience had taught him that no wild beasts are such dangerous enemies to man as Christians are to one another. Julian's whole family had been murdered by Constantine. If you want more of the background of the story, there were certain reasons that brought him to his own theological position. Mercifully for the Christians, he was dead within 2 years. And from then on, there would be no pagan emperor in the Roman Empire, quite deliberately. But there is another view of Constantine at Nicaea by another modern scholar that may be more relevant in this context. This is one position. I ask you to think about this. The emperor wanted unanimity, and now that a formula apparently satisfactory to the great majority had emerged, he used all of his influence to persuade the remaining doubters to conform. He probably did not realize how paralyzing an effect his imperial presence had on free discussion, and how far the apparently willing consent of the great majority was due to deference to his authority. The paralyzing effect is what this commentator chose to stress. And again, there are many views of this account, of this moment. They're all biased. They're all informed by what later happened. But I want you to think about the effect of Constantine's presence, the political figure in the midst of a group of religious thinkers, especially one who claims that he wishes to be informed about the truth of religious doctrine, to learn from them, in essence. Is there a danger in trying too hard to accommodate oneself to the political establishment? I was anxious about a lot of these things, and I asked a friend of mine, should a Christian be involved in politics? And his response was, and I don't mean any disrespect to any public servant among us, if you lie down with dogs, you get up with fleas. One position. However sincerely motivated, the chill descended on freedom of thought, which had been energetic, which had been a dynamic fact of life in early Christian history. If the job is to ferret out what the political leader, who has the power of exile, if not execution at his disposal, thinks, what real incentive is there to challenge the received wisdom, the orthodoxy to which you're being exposed? What incentive, therefore, is there to think for yourself in a context like that? When I was in college, I attended a lot of conferences. I was the president of the Southern Baptist Student Union at my university, and I was invited to many conferences. I went to seminaries around the South, which is where most of these are based. I met seminarians, and they were experiencing in the late 80s and early 90s the chill descending on not only their theological positions, but their political positions. And they felt and expressed that to me in very dynamic ways. They felt, in many ways, that they were being asked to adhere to a political as well as a religious orthodoxy, that they were being forced to turn away from traditionally Baptist points of view, freedom of thought among local congregations, democratic self-government, lack of theological rigidity among Baptist congregations. No one point of view had always been very enshrined Baptist positions. The positions represented, for example, by Jimmy Carter, by Bill Clinton in some ways. Those kinds of Baptist positions, which they felt were now being replaced with a tacit understanding that to be Baptist, one must be pro-life, anti-gay, in lockstep with the moral majority, and a Republican voter solid every time the voting booth came your way. They felt that Baptists were turning away from activists for civil rights, that they were being encouraged not to think about global poverty, that they were being asked to abandon what they thought was the message of Jesus, that they thought as Baptists they were upholding. The subtle enforcement of this orthodoxy among deacons promoted splits to which Baptist churches, perhaps more than any other denomination, are particularly susceptible. But more often than not, what I witnessed and others in my denomination witnessed was the quiet surrender, the quiet lack of any dissent to the dominant point of view. This could be a danger, even if it doesn't find its way into a worldwide bestseller. The danger of what can happen to a religion that ties itself too closely to a political establishment, however well-intended that attachment is.
In my health insurance, I found that I usually cannot get benefits for services or procedures which are not FDA approved. And yet I was surprised last year to see approval for Christian Science practitioners and nurses as approved providers. Have any of their procedures or methods been approved by the FDA?
No. And It's interesting because Christian Scientists are also approved Medicare providers, which is something that a lot of people don't know. The rationale is that it would be burdensome for Christian Scientists, in the case of Medicare, to have to pay taxes to support something that they can't benefit from. And the Christian Science attorneys argued that since Christian Science was just another kind of health care, that the government should be paying for things that happen in Christian Science facilities, even though there's no medical treatment going on. As far as private insurance goes, I can't speak for the private insurers, but I would imagine some of the arguments were the same.
When you were talking about the different laws that have been enacted with preference given to Christian Science, how much of the fault do you think should be placed on the legislature for not, I guess, seeing through the rhetoric or doing things or really closely examining it and just enacting these laws?
Well, it's something this widespread and complicated. I think the fault can be shared by a lot of individuals. But I do think the legislature bears a lot of responsibility. And I understand legislators are busy and that they're doing a lot of different things and dealing with a lot of different issues. But too often, I think it's easy for legislatures to listen to the pressure groups and overlook their responsibility to people who have no pressure group. For example, children. Children are not voters. They're never going to go to the legislature, and they're not going to be writing letters, and they're not going to be donating money to any campaigns. And I think legislators have a responsibility to be looking out for these powerless groups. And in these cases, yes, I believe they've failed in that responsibility.
Should perhaps religion step into politics where politicians will not go? For example, in the state of Florida, homosexuality is a crime. Adultery is a crime. These are not enforced, but the laws are still on the books of the state of Florida. No politician, no one who relies on the vote is going to get up and be labeled as being in favor of adultery. When religion turns so far in on itself, how should the politician react?
Are you asking if religious leaders started speaking out against these exemptions? Would that, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yes, something like that. If the core for religious science, and I use that as a very broad term here, if religious justification is the basis for religious or for Christian Science practitioners, should perhaps religion, as a more broad-based term, more conventional monotheistic religions, should they perhaps ferret out something like these? No child left behind. We're all out. We're raising the generation of the overprotected, and these sort of things. How does religion attack religion?
I think that would be difficult to do. While I, as a child advocate, would welcome anyone speaking out against these kinds of exemptions that endanger children, I think that the issue becomes it's impossible for the government to give preference to one religion over another. So while Christian Scientists are somewhat unique in that they have practitioners that are recognized healers, and they have their own licensing program for them and their own medical facilities for Christian Scientists, the same laws that protect the Christian Scientists protect other religions, like the followers of Christ, which was the religion involved in the 2-year-old that was stung to death by wasps not long ago that many of you remember, and other religions. Those laws protect all of the religions equally. And in fact, in a lot of cases with the vaccinations, then the argument becomes, well, does it have to be a recognized religion, or can it be just someone's motivation? So while I would welcome anybody to speak out against these religious exemptions, and I think religious leaders would have a powerful voice, I think ultimately that it might be difficult for them also to get rid of some of these exemptions.
One year I was teaching world comparative religions at Colonial High School, and I showed them a tape of the Scopes monkey trial, and I got a lot of negative feedback from that from the administrators, and it goes to, there are a lot of issues. The main one that concerned me is that Harcourt and Macmillan and the textbook publishers are pretty much looking for a mass market, and the committees in Texas and California determine what's in those books, and a lot of that stuff is just watered down, intelligent design stuff when that's not how we got here. I was wondering what your opinion was on that.
I agree.
And the statistic given earlier today I thought was really interesting, that in the 1920s there was a general consensus among the American people that either evolution was true or the old Earth theory was true. And in many ways we've retrogressed. I think that's the obvious conclusion, is that we've moved away from the consensus that was common 80 years ago, which is astonishing because if you think of the other innovations in the past 80 years. And I think that you put it exactly right, that it's not necessarily persecution, but it's the fear that if a teacher tries to do something, what the parents will do. Will the administration back you up? If I presented a certain thing in a classroom, now of course as a professor I may have a little more latitude, but as you may know in this state, that has also been challenged by legislative action in many parts of the country to make sure that professors are also encouraging an orthodoxy. And as someone devoted to the idea of freedom of thought, which is what I think I should be, I find that really terrifying. And I think that anybody who's an educator ought to.
And rhetorically, the same arguments about how science is just another belief system, you'll see those in the evolution cases also.
I've heard it suggested that the conversion of Constantine to Christianity and the Christian influence on the Roman Empire played a significant role in the fall of the empire in the next 100 years. And I've also heard that no, Christianity was co-opted to help control the masses. Since this is your specialty, what is your opinion?
This was the claim of Edward Gibbon in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the first volume of which was published in 1776, interestingly enough, the same year our country was created. His argument was fully in line with Enlightenment values. He believed that Christianity caused the fall of the empire, and made no bones about that. If you read the original document, it's pretty clear. I would say, though, that from one perspective, what Constantine did was completely unexpected. It wasn't a smart political move, and I would think most scholarship on the issue would say that for him to support a religion that was at the moment being persecuted, that was maybe 5% of the total Roman Empire at the time, in terms, and not widely distributed throughout the empire either, may be evidence of a sincere and genuine conversion. Because what else would explain that? He may have seen that there was that Christianity could unify the empire, but his experience demonstrated there were a lot of people not willing to convert. So he lost those people by adhering so closely to Christianity. So I would say that it's impossible to know anyone's mind, but if I could make a suggestion, I think that it's impossible to deny what he said, that he did have some kind of conversion that allowed him to look at Christianity in a completely new light. But I would also suggest that that is not necessarily a great thing for Christianity, and I hope that that's what I present today.
I've heard some things in lectures, and I've also seen it on several documentaries about how the Romans' persecution of Christians wasn't exactly what we think of it as today. What we think of it today, and I wanted to ask you if you think that that's generally true, and if so, how?
That's a wonderful question. I do in most of my courses try to make an effort about persecutions, because I think the assumption that many people have is that Christians were being rounded up and tortured for 300 years before Constantine. That's true and not true, because one way to look at it is that the Roman Empire was not a modern society. There were limits to their technological sophistication. There were limits to what they could enforce. And when persecutions happened, they were not empire-wide until about 250 CE or 250 AD. They were sporadic, but they were also incredibly violent. The records we do have suggest that Christians did suffer if they were unfortunate enough to live in a place where they were being persecuted. The other part of the story is that some Christians, when offered the chance, recanted their beliefs And one of the earliest controversies in Christianity was what happens when the persecution ends. Do you welcome back the people who had given up their faith to keep themselves alive? And of course, Christian charity would tell you you should be generous and kind and forgive. When the rubber hit the road, there were some people not willing to forgive because they had lost relatives, they had lost income, they had lost everything they owned, and others were still alive and still flourishing. So I would look at it, it's a very complicated story until you get to about 300 when there was a general persecution of Christians. I think that Christians should be aware that the persecutions were violent and were deadly if they were unfortunate enough to live in those areas. But to take, therefore, a persecution complex that Christians have always been persecuted is actually, Gibbon's argument was that if you totaled up the number of people killed in the name of Christ compared to the most generous estimate of those killed by the Romans who were Christians, there would be absolutely no comparison of the two. And again, that was part of his larger argument of the danger of Christianity. But I think that as a historian, that's obviously true.